All right, welcome everyone. I see the room is now open. We're seeing some friends starting to pour in, which is fantastic. Awesome stuff here. All right, let's make sure. Okay, yes, so there we go. We've got, looks like over 40 joining us so far, with that number quickly increasing. Awesome. We're going to try to get on, we're trying to get this going here within the next minute, so we stick to a schedule and give Tom as much time as he needs to drive home his points for this session. As you come into the room, do us a huge favor. Let us know, where are you coming from? What's your role in education? And what is your big takeaway so far from the conference? We are super excited to be welcoming Tom Schimmer here. I will come back to give Tom a formal introduction. Before we do, a quick shout out to our sponsors for helping us to keep this professional learning experience free for everyone around the world. This morning, we had some friends from, I guess it wouldn't be morning from where they're coming from, but we had some friends coming to us from Australia. We had a few people coming to us from Asia, in different parts of Asia, and of course, many from North America. So let us know where you're coming from in the chat. And once again, make sure that you check out our sponsors and all of the awesome resources that they have to share. Today, at the end of this session, if you stick around, Tom is going to be selecting someone from the group to grab a copy of Invigorating High School Math from one of our sponsors, Heinemann. And also note that Steve and Eric, the authors of this book, are also, Steve is actually presenting a session later today. So be sure to check that out once you are done here. Awesome to see. I see we have some friends from BC. I see New Zealand. Hey, Sue from New Zealand. Friends from Texas. And we've got Donna coming from Calgary, Alberta. Awesome. And that number of participants continues to rise as some of our other sessions let out. Awesome stuff. Quick reminder to everyone, replays are accessible as soon as they are available. So once this session is done, we'll edit it down, send it up to the web, and you will have access to that until later this evening. After that, the Summit software or the platform goes away, but we will keep those replays inside of the Make Math Moments Academy. You can grab 30 days for free by following that link you see down at the bottom of the screen. So be sure to grab those 30 days so you can continue the learning for the next month. Certificates will be passed out, or a link, I should say, will be shared with you via email tomorrow, so that you can grab your certificate of attendance, which might be helpful for PD credits or other certification requirements that you have in your jurisdiction. All right, my friends, without further ado, I'd like to move along to our featured speaker for this time slot. Just trying to get back to my, whoa, where did it go? Let me get back to that slide. Where are you? There we are. Oh, my computer is giving me a little bit of a problem. There we are. Awesome. So Tom Schimmer is hanging out with us. Tom is an independent author, speaker, and consultant from Vancouver. And Tom is actually an author that has had a huge impact on how John and I both assess and evaluate. John and I, as many of you probably know from our podcast, we were teaching in a very, we'll call it a traditional sense. In our minds, a traditional sense was how we were taught for many years. And we finally realized that we were not being equitable or giving an accessible opportunity to all students in our classroom. Tom's work around standards-based grading has really opened our eyes to looking at how we can assess and evaluate in our math classrooms to be more accessible, to provide more accessibility for all students and a more equitable learning opportunity. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Tom. Tom, my friend, are you with us here today? How's things going in your part of the world today?
I'm here. Yeah, absolutely. I'm in a hotel room in Boise, Idaho. I'm on the road back facilitating workshops and working with schools and districts. So great to see you. Hopefully the lighting is okay. Hotel rooms don't always have the best setup for webinars, but I think we're good to go.
Awesome. It's looking good on our end. So my friend,
Excellent.
I'm going to mute my mic and the camera, and my friends, enjoy this session.
Great.
Here with Tom.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're coming from today. Really pleased to join you. We only have an hour, of course, a lot to talk about. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a link in the chat box for the handout material. It's not important that you print it or anything like that, but it's just a takeaway for you. So I'm going to put that in the chat, and just if you could just confirm that, maybe just give me a thumbs up or something, or let me know if that link is working. If it's not, I'll try to make sure it's working from the Google Doc. You should get a PDF of the handout. Okay, so we're going to talk assessment today, because certainly the title of the session is Assessing Beyond Right and Wrong, and the important part about assessment is that the bigger picture is that learning goals are becoming much more sophisticated, and that includes math. So the thing I'm going to try to drive home today is that while math is definitely, a different subject, of course, the fundamentals of assessment are really universal. And despite the fact that there might feel like there's some differences in how we teach math, it's actually more similar than different in terms of how we might go about assessing, because it really does come down to those fundamentals. So we're going to spend some time talking about assessment fundamentals and how they apply to math, and why we need to get past this notion of right and wrong. And I know, math for me was actually choice number 2. I hit a fork in the road. Interesting enough, I'm in Boise, Idaho. I went to Boise State University here in Boise, and I was doing a campus walk yesterday. Just, every once in a while when I happen to come back to the city, and I grab a coffee on a Saturday morning and I walk the campus, and I came across the mathematics building. And that was the fork in the road for me. I was basically, it was a coin flip between a history degree and a mathematics degree. I almost was that close to becoming a math teacher, and and really loved math, and certainly did really well in math. But I did really well in math in high school in the 1980s, the early 1980s, because I knew how to sort of follow the logic of an algorithm. I knew how to follow the procedures. What I didn't learn in school necessarily was the critical thinking behind math, the understanding of the why behind the math. And that's something that I think we see more and more in our work now, in the work that we see with outcomes and standards and goals that different jurisdictions have sort of brought to the forefront for schools in the 21st century. So let's get started. For me, so I have a love and a passion for math. I have taught math before at the middle school level. I taught grade 8 math for 3 years, and really enjoyed it. You're certainly not trained enough to teach high school math, but middle school math was kind of in my wheelhouse. And I really enjoyed that. But I can't say, I almost wish I could go back. Knowing what I know now, I wish I could go back, because that math teacher in me predates my assessment work. Well, it was kind of in that role that I began this assessment journey. And so I wish I had a do-over, if you will, because I'd love to be able to go back and teach those classes again with the assessment work that I've been able to sort of grow in. Okay, so as we get started today, I just want to very quickly share with you my title slide, and this is also on the title page of the handout, and lots of ways to stay connected to me. There's Twitter, there's Instagram, Facebook, probably too many social media accounts, as I often say, but one becomes another. And the next thing you know, you've got all these accounts that you kind of have to manage. Email is there on the bottom left-hand side of the listings there. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, is through email or direct message on social media. And you can see in the center and the bottom another way to be connected. And appreciated Heather's mention in the chat of the podcast. I do have a podcast as well, and if you want to stay connected and listen to some great people talk about education and learn about assessment, that podcast might be for you. So you can find that Apple, Spotify, all of that stuff. Okay, enough of the shameless plugs. We're going to talk about going beyond right, wrong, because when I was in school, I remember math was really all about getting the answers right or wrong. And the challenge with math, of course, is when you take that sort of, I would say, reductionist approach. Now, let me just pause for a minute. I don't want anybody to misunderstand. It is important that students get the right answer. I'm not saying that they can be just constantly and infinitely wrong all the time, but there's a bigger picture at play here, right? It's not just about that. So that's really what I'm talking about. So I don't want you to misunderstand to say, Tom doesn't care if kids know how to solve the third side of a right triangle. It doesn't matter. It does matter. At some point it does matter. But we have to start thinking beyond that, because the learning goals and our assessment practices can definitely take us beyond that. The big picture of 21st century learning, and my colleagues and I wrote about this in a book we titled Growing Tomorrow's Citizens in Today's Classrooms. We talk about how in the 21st century, what we are seeing collectively is we're seeing the means and ends switching places. So at the start of the 21st century, and about a decade into the 21st century, we saw a lot of skills. Like if you look on the left-hand side, you think about critical thinking and creativity and communication, collaboration, digital citizenship, social competence. These are the 7 critical competencies that Cassandra, Nicole, and I wrote about in our book. Now, it's not as if we hadn't done many of these things before. It's not as if teachers in the 90s didn't have their students think critically. So we were pressed with this question intrinsically, we were pressed with this question: what's the difference if in fact we've done critical thinking in the 90s, if in fact, for example, we put students into collaborative teams in the 90s, then what distinguishes this idea of 21st century learning or 21st century competencies? What is the difference between them? And as we started to think about it, we started to think about the idea of the means and ends switching places. So I went back into my own, as we were formulating this, I went back into my own history and thought about the differences when our Ministry of Education in British Columbia started coming out, about a decade ago, talking about 21st century learning. And I remember working at the district office in School District 67, working with a group of teachers and principals and talking about what the ministry had first come out with. And one of the things that I started to think about was, what is the difference between them? And so the way we've articulated that is when you look at what you see on the screen, think of the means and ends going from left to right. You see, what we did before is we did put students into collaborative teams. We did put students into situations where they had to think critically. We put students into situations where they were, communicating, et cetera, all of those skills, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was content acquisition. The goal was what you see on the right-hand side. And so the bigger picture of how learning is evolving, I think, in the 21st century, and certainly we are 2 decades into the 21st century, but where we're seeing the difference is that the means and ends are switching places, right? So if you look at now, if you switch them back, so again, we go here, critical competencies, feeding curricular content. Now we're in a situation where curricular content is feeding the competencies. So in other words, before we used to, I should say, put you into situations where you were thinking critically in order to acquire and learn math content. And now the perspective in so many different places is we're using math content to teach you how to think critically. We're using math content to teach you how to collaborate, because those larger, bigger picture 21st century skills are really what we're trying to drive home. Now, when you think about, I just grabbed 4 what we call in British Columbia curricular competencies that are associated with different grade levels of mathematics. Now, as you read through those, I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them as you see them on the screen, but I want you to read through them. These are fairly clearly articulated goals within our British Columbia math curriculum. And I want you to notice that almost none of them, basically of these 4, none of them can be assessed along the reductionist line of right and wrong. There are going to be gradations of quality. There are going to be, situations where students are going to present evidence of learning that is much more sophisticated, much more involved. You can't multiple choice any of these. This requires us as math teachers to think about a more expansive view of what evidence looks like. Because thinking creatively and with curiosity and wonder when exploring problems, when you talk about inquiry or problem solving, incorporating first people's worldviews, these are aspects that go far beyond the idea of just getting a correct answer and just filling in an assignment sheet or something like that, or just answering the questions in the back of the textbook. we have admittedly much loftier goals for our learners. And part of our challenge, of course, is rising to the level of promise for our students, of taking our practices to a place where we can fulfill the promise of these outcomes. And this is just a snippet of what those competencies are. And of course, how are we going to do this? We're going to need math content in order to do these things. So I often remind people that these loftier goals are important, but they're often lacking substance, right? So look at the bottom one. Think creatively and with curiosity and wonder when exploring problems. That, of course, is a fairly sophisticated learning goal. The question would be, what problems? So you can't not have math content feeding into these goals, because you have to ask, okay, what vocabulary, what language, what are we talking about? But look at that top one, mathematical discussions. The idea of creating or engineering conversations amongst students about problem solving, about strategies, about, what is the right point of entry into a problem, as opposed to thinking there is a singular approach. These are lofty goals, and certainly we have to, understand from an assessment perspective how we raise our game and allow ourselves to fulfill the promise of what the curriculum promises our students. This is from NCTM. And as I was sort of thinking about this session, I looked at some of the things that NCTM advocates for, and a few of them particularly caught my attention. One, again, the idea of implementing tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving, right? Not just getting right answers, but notice in the descriptor there at the sort of last, on the third line, I should say, or the last sentence, multiple entry points and varied solution strategies. That doesn't sound like right, wrong. That sounds like a more sophisticated approach to mathematics for sure. When you think about facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse, when's the last time that students were tasked with being in a group of 3 or 4 and having a conversation about how to best address a problem? And again, the age of the students is going to dictate the sophistication and the degree to which you can engineer this. But, if we're talking grade 1 or we're talking, grade 12, high school seniors or wherever we are, there's always the opportunity to have those conversations, because remember that as students are talking about their learning, they often they often deepen their understanding. I'm actually, this is actually going to be a topic on my next podcast coming out tomorrow, is this idea of conversations and how we can engineer these conversations with students, and how important it is. Because remember, sometimes students' written output is much less than their verbal output. A lot of times you'll get more evidence from students when you have them talk. And for students, it deepens their understanding, because when they're talking to one another, remember, they're gaining access to other students' thinking. So it helps them. And plus, you've got a more active classroom. You haven't got students just passively sitting and absorbing information, but they're getting access to what other students think is the right approach. And all of that can contribute to their learning for sure. And certainly the second to last caught my attention, supporting productive struggle. This idea of right and wrong really is conducive to getting it right. And I think there's 2 things that happen in mathematics. And again, I know I'm not a math teacher. I just played one in real life for 3 years. But I think there's a couple of things that we unfortunately at times emphasize in mathematics. One, of course, is the right wrong approach. You're either right or you're wrong. And the other that I think we overemphasize is speed. I think that too often speed, the speed at which a student can answer a problem or a series of problems, will interfere with your ability to truly understand what they know. Now, I'm not talking about speed on the macro. I understand semesters end, and I understand report cards are due, grading periods, and we have to do all of those things. But inside those parameters that are beyond our control, do we have the opportunity to allow for that productive struggle, right? Are they able to learn from their mistakes, and through reassessment and new learning, all of that, and be able to sort of, is it okay to struggle? Or have we inadvertently created an environment where there's a kind of, mileage, if you will, like social mileage gained from getting it right the first time and being the fastest, and all of those different sort of aspects that don't really get to the heart of what we're trying to help students learn. And certainly, the struggle and the stick-to-itiveness. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, in chapter 12, which was all about math and the idea of perseverance and the idea of stick-to-itiveness. And I'm not saying that chapter should be held up as a gospel or anything like that, but I think it's a really important concept that it's okay to struggle, and we have to be comfortable with this idea. I think the right, wrong, and the speed is why for generations, math has been that intimidating subject. Math has been that subject. And I can tell you from my own experience as both a teacher and probably more importantly, a school administrator, it is important as our literacy goals were. Math was the subject that probably caused more anxiety in our students than any other subject. It created, there was an atmosphere around mathematics that, we noticed it. We didn't know quite at the time how to correct it, but it was clear to me now that an overemphasis of just being right and being fast can really sort of undercut the kind of thinking and problem solving approach to mathematics and the productive struggle that we're trying to accomplish. So from an assessment perspective, I think there are some things that are timeless, and this is more the bigger picture here, the big ideas. On the left-hand side, the timeless pieces around assessment that will, regardless of whether the learning goals are changing or not, we will always need to have balanced assessment systems and utilize assessment formatively. And again, I'm going to keep saying this as we go through the session, that when you think about formative assessment, remember that formative assessment is more a verb than a noun. Formative is not just a summative that doesn't count. It's not something where, it's a thing. It can be, most certainly, but remember, labeling something formative doesn't make it so. It's formative when it's used formatively. And so that means we're emphasizing feedback. So balanced assessment will always be here. Learning progressions. How do we take students from the simple to the sophisticated? How do I take you, for example, from knowing where the hypotenuse is to being able to solve the third side of a right triangle in an authentic or real world application type problem? Learning progression, simple. And if you're wondering what a learning progression is, think about teaching a child how to ride a bicycle or teaching a child how to swim. That's a learning progression. We go from simple to sophisticated. Effective feedback. Feedback allows us to make instructional adjustments. We want to have clear criteria, gradations of quality, self and peer assessment. Those are timeless practices that no matter what the learning goals are, we are always going to be tasked with making sure that those fundamentals are in place. Now, what is transforming? What we're seeing, in real time is we're seeing a more student-driven learning approach. The idea of inquiry, the idea of investigation, the idea of problem-based learning, that's coming to the forefront. The rigor of the expectations is certainly growing. As we talked about in the earlier examples, when I showed you those 4 outcomes, we're seeing a lot of increase in performance assessment as well. Now, some of you may or may not sort of understand the term performance assessment, because some of us think of performances, right? But technically, a performance assessment is any demonstration of mastery that attempts to emulate the authentic context within which the learning is meant to be applied. So that's a performance assessment. If what you're asking the students to do is authentic, and sometimes I'll say to teachers, I'll remind them that, what engineers do in the real world? Engineers solve equations. So just because you're solving an equation doesn't mean it's not authentic. The question is the equation based out of some sort of authentic context? Is this a real world problem or an authentic problem that an engineer would have or a scientist would have to wrestle with, right? So that's really what performance assessment is. Yes, sometimes it's seen or heard in order to assess it, but just understand that the true definition of a performance assessment is essentially a constructed response that attempts to emulate that authentic context. As I talked earlier, we're talking about content as the means. We're starting to transform those subject silos and starting to look cross-curricularly in ways that are unique and universal. You take something like mathematical computation. For those in the United States, that mathematical computation is obviously mathematics, but it's also a science and engineering practice in next generation science standards. You look at analyzing and interpreting data, statistics and probability, but also analyzing and interpreting data, also a science outcome, also something we can do in physical education, also something we can do in health. So we're starting to see that when we focus on those skills, they're transferable, and we're starting to break down some of those subject silos. And the other part that's transforming is the transferability of those competencies: critical thinking, collaborative thinking, creative thinking. Now, I put an asterisk there because it's important to know that transferability can't be assumed, and transferability is sometimes difficult because, for example, the research on teaching critical thinking has success in teaching critical thinking tied to one's competency within a discipline. So how much I know about the mathematics will help me think critically about mathematics. And that's why students can, maybe think deeply about mathematics, but then they move into their social studies class and they struggle with problem solving because they don't know as much about it. So it's not that transferability is not the goal. We can still have that as a goal. We just have to understand that there isn't sort of an automaticity behind the transferability, that we have to work on that transferability so that students aren't doing critical thinking at school. Students are becoming critical thinkers, but as a dispositional default. That's kind of what I'm talking about there. So, math class, social studies class, science class, doesn't matter. Assessment is the engine that drives everything that we do. There's a lot of shiny objects in schools, a lot of things that catch our attention, a lot of things that really come to the forefront. But when I walk into a school and I lift the hood and I want to check out what's happening with assessment, I'll know what's happening in that school, and I'll know whether or not that school has a real focus and a foundation that helps them reach all of the goals that they want to reach. Assessment drives everything. I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want you to sort of look at this and consume this, but understand that there is nothing around this wheel, and these are but 8 examples, but there is nothing around this wheel that you can be successful at without sound assessment practices. None of these things can at least maximize you. Of course, you're going to have some success, but you can't maximize your success because assessment drives all of these different aspects of school. So I mentioned earlier, my colleagues, Cassandra and Nicole, and I have written books on my own. I've written with other writing partners, but certainly Cassandra, Nicole, and I are a team. And we wrote this book called Essential Assessment that really outlined what we call our 6 assessment tenets. And it's not a case where we've invented certain assessment tenets, but what we tried to do was bring together the last 20 years or so. We wrote this book back it was published in 2017. But when we looked at the landscape and we said, what have we learned in assessment over the last, 20 years or so? And that's where and how we landed on 6 assessment tenets that you see in the framework in color in that graphic, right? So it's student investment, it's assessment purpose, it's architecture. So how we design our assessments, how we communicate the results, are we instructionally agile, and how do we interpret the results? They're not really ranked in any order. They're not of any importance at all in terms of assessment growth, except there is one strategic placement for us, and that is student investment. Something to think about when it comes to developing your own assessment literacy, your own understanding of sound assessment, is that that's not the end game. I say to teachers in schools and groups all the time that you becoming as expert as possible in assessment is not the goal. The goal is for you to become as expert as possible in assessment so that you can teach the students how to do this on their own behalf, so they can become more self-regulatory about their learning, so we can help them become self-assessors and peer assessors and be more active in that role. So I'm convinced now, after, I've been immersed in this work for 17 years now, going on 18. It started for me back in 2003, 2004 school year. And, when I was teaching grade 8 math, and I have not looked back, and I recognize now that I will say till I'm blue in the face, investing in your assessment literacy is the most efficient and effective professional investment any teacher can make, because once you understand assessment, everything falls into place. But something I want you to notice about the center. It's really easy to think about assessment as just a clinical exercise in number crunching. And if we take the approach in mathematics that it's all about whether you got the answer right or wrong, then you really can get into that idea of filling in spreadsheets, producing ratios, and figuring out how many the student, got right or wrong. We want collectively, Cassandra, Nicole, and I, we want everyone to understand the emotional side of assessment. What we've learned, along with all of the, important technical aspects of assessment, is that assessment is not just a technical exercise in number crunching, that there is an emotional side to assessment, that through our assessment practices, you can actually build hope and efficacy and achievement. Assessment has always been about achievement, but the idea of hope and efficacy, there is this emotional side to assessment. And again, if we're being honest about maybe where disproportionately some of those emotional reactions come from, I can tell you just from my experience, they often do come from sort of the math experience that students have. Because again, traditionally, I want you to understand, I'm not trying to be critical, but I am trying to be honest about the fact that, in the schools I worked in, there was almost a sort of polarized reaction to math. There was no one would seem to be on the fence. We either loved it, or there were students who just, didn't want anything to do with it. Hope is about expectation. Hope is about the light at the end of the tunnel. When I have hope, I can see it. Efficacy is the belief that I can get there. So something to ask yourself is, in your climate of assessment within your classroom, are you building hope and efficacy, or are you potentially, and this is most important to say, inadvertently undermining student hope and efficacy? No one does this on purpose. I didn't do it on purpose 30 years ago when I first started teaching, but I know it happened in my classroom. It happened because I wasn't paying attention to it. That's why. So I'm not suggesting anybody would do this on purpose. What I am suggesting, though, is it can happen in our classrooms inadvertently. So paying attention to how our students respond, whether or not they do feel more hopeful or optimistic about their eventual success, and whether or not they have that belief that they can do it. What kind of, mindset is there? This I can promise you. And I would say this to any teacher teaching any subject. Your students, all of them, will have an emotional reaction to the prospect of being assessed. That I can guarantee you. What I can't guarantee you is what that reaction is going to be. The question is, knowing that all students are going to have an emotional reaction to the prospect of being assessed, the question is that emotional reaction going to be productive? Like, are your students going to see assessment as an opportunity? Are they going to see assessment as something to, I don't want to say celebrate, but something as an opportunity to show what I know? Or are your students going to see assessment as something to be feared, as something that they should be cautious about? That's the question. The question is not whether or not they're going to have an emotional reaction. They will. They will have an emotional reaction. Monique Bocarts reminds us that students are constantly making choices as they appraise the cognitive and emotional demands of a task, and they will respond along one of two pathways. They'll respond along the growth pathway, or they will respond along the well-being pathway. So if they respond along that growth pathway, that's that productive response. As soon as they do that, then learners want information to increase their competence. They want to know how they can get better. They want to know how they can improve. If students feel, and I'm going to use this word, it sounds a little hyperbolic. I know it's not physical and all that, but if the students feel there is a threat, if they see the assessment experience as something to be feared, then they are probably going to choose the well-being pathway. And what the well-being pathway, she says, is used to protect themselves. It's a protectionist approach, right? Trying to protect ourselves from negative feelings of incompetence or anxiety by avoidance and denial. So a tactic on the well-being pathway is to forget there was an assignment, or to not come to class, or to avoid the situation at all costs. So again, reminding us that students are constantly assessing the cognitive and emotional demands of that task, and they're going to move along one of those two pathways. I also want to share with you something that I share with a lot of groups, and that is this notion of pressure. And I want us to take a moment here to think about the pressure that students feel around assessment. And again, if we're taking that reductionist approach, if there is no margin of error, if you're expected to get it right, not just get it right, but get it right quickly, then there can be a lot of pressure that surrounds a mathematics classroom. This is Henry Weisinger and J.P. Polly Fry, who published this book, Performing Under Pressure, The Science of Doing Your Best When It Matters the Most. And I talk about this all the time because I think it's just something I want to continue to drive home with all of us in education, that emphasizes the importance of the emotional side of assessment. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to bring it back to assessment. Okay, this will sort of, I'll walk you through it. First, the reason I'm bringing this to the table is because I want us to recognize that there are not many things in the school experience that young people experience that is more pressure packed than assessment. The only aspect of school that I think either rivals or maybe even surpasses assessment in terms of the pressure young people feel, and depends on their age, is the social dynamic. The social situation in schools for young people can be very pressure packed as well. So I'm going to assert that if assessment is not number one, it's number two in terms of the pressure students feel. So it's up there. So if assessment is as pressure packed as I am asserting, and I think it is, and again, it depends on the age, then we would be wise to think about how our assessment routines, how the assessment culture in our schools actually impacts that climate and the way students learn to handle pressure. So Weisinger and Polyfry in their research looked at society as a whole. They looked at professional athletes. They looked at highly successful people in business. They looked at society. This book isn't about just students. It's about people. And why, the overarching question was, why in our society do we have some people who have learned to handle pressure better than other people? Why have some people been able to handle those pressure situations in whatever context it might be in? Now, they dispel one myth in society. And the myth that they dispel through their research is that some people, when the pressure is on, some people are at their very best. That is just absolutely rare. It's more often than not, and disproportionately more often than not true. It is something where we've kind of romanticized this, but it's not the case that people perform better under pressure than they do otherwise. But here's the second part that they uncovered. Some people have learned to handle pressure better than other people. So those who handle pressure better than other people have not risen to the occasion. They've just not fallen as far. So if you can see my hands, watch how I'll describe this. No one performs better under pressure than they do otherwise. But some people have learned to handle pressure better than other people. And that's why it looks like these people have risen to the occasion. They haven't risen to the occasion. They just haven't fallen off as far. They've learned to handle pressure. So if that's the case, then we would be wise to ask ourselves from an assessment perspective, through our assessment practices, how are we, or to what degree are we helping our students learn to handle pressure? The book never talks about how to avoid pressure. You and I both know as adults, pressure is unavoidable in life. The key is to learn to handle pressure. Okay, this was a really interesting piece for me. And I really love this part of the book. When they talk about the sort of difference between stress and pressure. I'd never thought of it this way before I read this book, but the idea that stress is having too many demands and not enough resources, where pressure is a situation where something at stake is dependent upon the outcome of your performance. So there's a difference between stress. Adults experience, we experience stress on a daily basis. If you're an adult, to varying degrees that life is stressful. Life can also be very, joyful and fun and all of those things, but there's stress that's involved in life. And being a student, when you have a math test and you've got a science project and you've got an English essay, all due within the same week, that can be a lot of stress for students. But every single day can't be pressure. There's no adult. There's no professional sports team. There's no one can go full throttle for 180 straight days. Sometimes what happens in school is that every day is a game day. And we forget that students need room to breathe. Stress happens, but the idea of that student having several assignments due within a short period of time, that's not necessarily pressure. But if the student starts going down the road of manufacturing this as a pressure situation, and they start, wondering, oh my gosh, I have to get all these assignments done, and I've got this math test coming up, and my parents are going to be so disappointed with me, and I'm not going to get into the college of my choice, and I'm going to ruin my life for the next. So what they're doing is they're spiraling, and they're conflating stress and pressure. And conflating stress and pressure is never a good thing. As Weisinger and Polyfry found out, when we confuse daily stressful situations for pressure moments, this is the key. We react physically, mentally, and behaviorally in ways that are out of proportion to the circumstances. Say that again. out of proportion to the circumstances. I am disappointed to report to you that early in my teaching career, I would say things in my head or maybe to other colleagues about students and not recognize what was happening. Now, of course, I was ignorant to this idea of pressure and stress and conflating the two, but I used to say things like this. Boy, she's just overreacting. There she goes again, overreacting again. Or there he goes, making a, the cliche, the making a mountain out of a molehill. Like, she's just being dramatic again. And the truth is, they were. But the real truth is, I should have learned something from that. I should have recognized that my students were overreacting. They were reacting in ways that were disproportionate to the circumstances. And I wish I would have realized that in many of those cases, they were probably conflating stress and pressure. You see, as the quote goes on, the danger lies in the fact that continually confusing stress for pressure habituates. We lose our ability to think clearly, misdiagnosing stress as pressure reduces our abilities needlessly. Nothing good in terms of performance comes from an overexertion of pressure on students. And when we think that that's a good thing, it's probably been a long time since we were in that position. Because we've romanticized this idea of got to put the pressure on, especially in high school. So got to put the pressure on, got to get these kids ready for college or university. We got to put them through the wares. There's just no support for that. We've romanticized that. We think that's the case. So if we're thinking about our mathematics classrooms and our assessment, the atmosphere of assessment, ask yourself maybe, to what degree do my assessment practices in my math classroom, to what degree do they actually serve to have our students conflate stress and pressure? Inadvertently, I know you're not doing this on purpose, but it happens. And we have to start being aware. So watching how our students respond. But here's the good news. The good news is that Weisinger and Polly Fry actually uncovered 4 common characteristics. Remember those people who handle pressure better than other people? There were 4 common characteristics amongst those people. And those 4 common characteristics they called the coat of armor. Those in society who can handle pressure better than other people approach pressure situations with confidence, optimism, tenacity, and enthusiasm. So when you think about your classroom and the context of assessment in your mathematics classroom, ask yourself this question. To what degree do my assessment practices in my mathematics classroom contribute to or take something away from my students' coats of armor? Does their assessment experience in my classroom lead them to becoming more confident, optimistic, tenacious, and enthusiastic? Or have we just reduced mathematics to getting it right, getting it wrong? You're either right and you're right quickly. And if you don't learn fast enough, you're also disadvantaged in terms of what we report about your learning. Assessment is as pressure-packed as anything young people experience. And I think you could make the argument that mathematics in particular, as a subject traditionally, is up there when it comes to subject-specific pressure that students either self-inflicted or externally sourced, that pressure that students feel. So we would be wise to reflect on what assessment practices, what grading practices, how we mark assessments, all of that. How does that contribute to our students becoming more confident, more optimistic, more tenacious, more enthusiastic, or does it contribute to them being the opposite of that? So when we think about assessment and that atmosphere, I want us to remind ourselves there's a lot of technicalities to assessment, but we've got to get to a place where we're thinking about assessment and thinking about it along the way of creating a kind of context. Assessment, in essence, is relationship building. There is nothing that tells a student more about what truly matters to you than how you handle assessment, how you handle the situation where I need longer to learn. So when we think about the purpose of assessment, we know, and this is obviously not brand new information, but if we're going to get past right and wrong, we've got to put some things together here. And the first is to remind ourselves of the fact that assessment is just the gathering of evidence about student learning. that it's the use of the evidence that distinguishes the formative from the summative. And I mentioned this earlier, that labeling something formative does not make it so. An assessment is formative only when it's used formatively. Okay, so you think about it, what does it mean to use something formatively? Well, that means to prioritize feedback. So as a mathematics teacher, one might think, what is the degree to which I use effective feedback in my classroom? Descriptive feedback, feedback to advance learning. Now take a look again, let's go back to NCTM and let's think about some of the assertions about, promising mathematical practices in teaching. And let's think about, the use of assessment formatively. Where is there some advocacy for formative assessment? Well, I've just highlighted a few of them. Half of them really do have some aspect that hits formative assessment for sure. I mean, there others do as well, but I want to highlight these four in particular. The idea of meaningful mathematical discourse. Again, engineering conversations in your classroom as your students are having conversations about how to approach a problem. What's the right strategy? What are some alternative ways we could approach this problem? What's a different way to find the solution? As they're talking about their learning, you listening in on those conversations provides you with evidence about their thinking. So we have to, again, remember, evidence is evidence. And the formality, and this is something that I continue to hammer home both on my podcast and I hammer home with workshop audiences, which is that, and it comes from, one of my friends and colleagues, Leanne Young. She's often said, in various settings, that formality is not akin to validity. Again, what that means is the more formal an assessment is, it doesn't make it more valid. Evidence is evidence. And so when you have students talking about their learning, that's definitely a way for you to gather evidence of their thinking and be able to react to it. Posing purposeful questions, these questions that assess and advance the student's reasoning and sense making about important mathematical ideas and relationships. So when you're talking about advancing their reasoning, we're talking about learning. And so posing purposeful questions, asking questions is one of the most fundamental formative assessment strategies. And rather than asking the question to get some semblance of a correct answer, get evidence of their thinking and try to advance their reasoning. Productive struggle clearly is this idea of learning from our assessment mistakes and being able to advance our learning. And that has a formative element to it as well, of course. And this idea of productive struggle and eliciting and using evidence of thinking. Effective teaching in mathematics at the very bottom there uses evidence of thinking to assess progress toward mathematical understanding, right? And to adjust instruction. That is what Cassandra, Nicole, and I call instructional agility. To adjust instruction continually in ways that support and extend learning. So there's no question that from maybe the foremost authority in terms of mathematics, the collective group, if you will, that there is the use of assessment and the use of assessments formatively all over the recommendations and suggestions from NCTM. Now, here's where this all comes together. Rather than thinking about right, wrong, we think about using assessments formatively. And again, I want to keep emphasizing the fact that formative assessment is more a verb than a noun. It's about the action. Labeling something formative doesn't make it so, and a formative is much more than summative that doesn't count. So think of it as informative assessment. It informs instructional decisions. This comes from Maria Ruiz Primo and Min Lee. And I want you to pay attention to that first part. Okay, the results of decades of research on feedback and learning offers near unanimous agreement on the importance of feedback to improving student learning. Right? Feedback is how we improve student learning. If we want our students to deepen their mathematical understanding, if that's the learning, then we are going to have to emphasize effective feedback. Now, what sets me up to be able to provide students with feedback? Well, I have to gather evidence. I have to take inventory as to where they are. So the use of assessment formatively in classrooms, that, the gathering of the evidence, that's why the summative that doesn't count model is incomplete, because you have to turn that around and cause more learning. Now, if we're just right, wrong, yes, no, can, can't, got it, don't have it, 18 out of 20, 35 out of 50, if that's our approach, then we never really have the opportunity to advance their learning or provide any feedback, because a ratio or a score is not instructive, right? So you can tell me that I scored 80% on a test or an assignment or something like that, but the 80% does not inform me about what's next to close the gap, what's next to address the 20% that maybe was missing. It's not descriptive. So you'll always have to add that in anyway. Now, remember that when it comes to feedback, okay, feedback and formative scores can interfere with a student's willingness to keep learning. Sometimes students will settle for the score. They'll just settle for what the score says and not really take the feedback. So if you're providing, and when you're providing feedback to students, make sure that you watch how they respond if there's a formative score associated with that. So unanimous agreement in the academic literature that feedback is what advances achievement. Feedback is what advances learning. Now, the bottom part, here's where you have a little bit of freedom and maybe not as much guidance as you would like, because after decades, as they go on to say, it appears that as researchers, we know less about formative feedback than would have been predicted. But notice what they say here. Our degree of not knowing, however, must be appreciated as the accumulation of knowledge resulting from 30 years of research on feedback. So let me summarize this slide for you in a nutshell. Okay, top portion, we know feedback works. Bottom portion, there is absolutely no singular answer to the question, what absolutely works in feedback? So we know it works, but there is no perfect strategy. And what we're really looking for is the perfect reaction. We need that perfect reaction. And we need that action to be taken, because as Gordon Stobart writes, one reason feedback often has a limited impact is because of the lack of action and practice that accompanies it, right? So it's not just about the thinking, it's about the doing. It's about the taking action as a result of the feedback that I've been provided. So the existence of feedback is not enough to cause a learning explosion. It's not just like, hey, I give the students feedback and their achievement is going to go through the roof. No, they have to do something with the feedback. The lost art of corrections, even the lost art of going back and learning from our mistakes. Did I make a simple mistake? Was it an egregious error? That's one of the limitations of scores, right? And especially one of the limitations of percentages, because you could have two students score the same on an assessment, and yet they wouldn't be in the same place as learners. So example, you have two students who score 15 out of 20. I'm just going to use numbers for effect here. You have two students who score 15 out of 20 on a math test. One student, okay, he left 5 questions blank because he had conceptually no idea how to answer those questions. Now, on the other hand, you have this girl, she answered all 20 questions. She conceptually knew what to do for all 20 questions, but she made 5 simple mistakes, right? 4 times 7 became 11 instead of 28, right? So that happens to students. They make simple mistakes. So you have one student who had no idea how to answer 5 problems. You have another student who answered all 5 of those problems, all 20 of the problems, but made 5 simple errors. Both of those students will end up at 15 out of 20. Both of those students will end up with a 75%. But those two students are not in the same place as learners, and you know that. Except the percentage score, the ratio score, will not communicate that. So at best, very best, a ratio or percentage score is incomplete because it doesn't account for the type of error that the student made, only that it was right or wrong. And so at best, you get an incomplete view of the learner. So it's the action. And if the score is getting in the way of the action, then we need to hold that score until it's time to assess, grade the summative purpose, because we want our students to take our feedback and advance their learning. Another research synthesis. This is again just one, but this is an example of sort of a synthesis of the research, where in this particular study, they looked at 18 studies on feedback. And what they noticed is that in half of the 18 studies, the feedback that was being examined was actually more evaluative in nature and focused solely on correctness. So even when teachers think they're providing feedback, the feedback itself is still sort of evaluative in nature and focused solely on correctness. And again, this is just one study, but I want you to sort of understand the big message here. This is the most important part, is point number 2, that of those 8, none of those studies, none of them incorporated any pedagogical follow-up after the feedback, right? So what ended up happening, and this is specific to math, these are math, this is math classrooms. These are math classrooms that were being studied. Students had to figure out on their own what was next for them. And so you almost pop the balloon. I mean, providing the feedback is such a positive step forward, and yet with no follow-up, students just floundering, trying to figure things out on their own, the impact was lost, right? So what informs teaching and learning is the feedback. The pedagogical follow-up would be critical, and when that's not there, the impact of feedback is essentially diminished. So we have to realize that the use of feedback and the active use of feedback, but Tom, I don't have time for kids to be working on the feedback. I've got so much content to cover. I've got so many things to get through. I'm empathetic to that, but our goal is learning, okay? If our goal is to advance student learning, and we have unanimous agreement in the academic literature that says it's through effective or descriptive feedback that we advance learning, there's no question that that's how we advance it, then we don't not have time. We don't not have the ability. We have to do it. We have to provide feedback, unless we are just focused on right and wrong and who got it, who didn't got it, and just trying to sort through the students. That's our goal. Then, and it shouldn't be our goal because that's not the mandate. None of our mission statements will say that. We talk about making sure that all learners reach high levels of intellectual performance, not just the elite, not just who get it right the first time, and all of those different constructs that we've formulated over time. So again, there's just such an enormous amount of information that tells us how important feedback is. And so we have to get past right and wrong, and we have to start looking at the type of error. We have to start looking at evidence of their thinking. We've got to start putting students in a position where they're lifting themselves, and we're helping lift them to those high levels of intellectual performance. So in your classrooms, if you're going to advance this idea of feedback and the effectiveness of feedback, Valerie Shute reminds us we've got to have a context within which feedback can be supported. So what I'm sharing with you here is the context of your classroom, and then we'll talk about the strategies, and then we'll finish up for our time together. But Valerie Shute in 2008 talked about, and I thought this was really interesting, when she talked about what you need in order for feedback to thrive in your classroom is motive, opportunity, and means. Okay. Motive is in reference to whether or not the learner needs the feedback. Opportunity is whether the learner receives the feedback at a time when they are most able to use it. That's often something that happens in classrooms too, is that feedback comes so late, or often it comes on the summative assessment and it's expressed in a way like, wow, you should have done this and you should have done that. And boy, it would have been great if you used the right formula. And instead of giving the feedback when there's time for students to act upon the feedback, remember this fundamental. Any feedback that you provide students that they are unable or not permitted to act upon is essentially useless feedback. So motive is important, opportunity is important, and means is important. Does the student have the willingness and the capacity to act upon the feedback? Now, I want you to imagine that one of these is missing. Like imagine that you provide the students feedback, and let's say you provided a formative score. And the formative score says they're somewhat competent in what they're doing. Maybe not exemplary, but they're pretty competent. You give them the opportunity to act upon your feedback. The student clearly has the capacity to do something with the feedback, but the student looks at that formative score and says, yeah, I'm good with the 3. It all falls apart. They ignore your feedback. Imagine a situation where students are recognizing they need the feedback. They have the capacity to act upon the feedback, but you've provided the feedback, but no opportunity for the students to act upon the feedback. It all falls apart. Let's imagine the student recognizes the feedback is needed, and you provide that feedback and the opportunity to act upon that feedback. But the feedback is so sophisticated for where I am in my learning right now that it's not helping me get to the next step. It's 12 steps ahead of where I am. It's out of reach for me. It's too sophisticated for me. So I don't have the capacity to do in this immediate moment what you're asking me to do. It all falls apart. Again, for feedback to thrive in your classroom, there needs to be the motive, the opportunity, and the means. Two more things as we finish up. One being the 5 keys to effective feedback. We gather evidence. Remember, gathering evidence is gathering evidence. There's not this separate silo of formative assessment and summative assessments. The strategies are the strategies. It's what you do with the evidence. So you could do everything you do with assessment, but just change the way you handle it. So rather than just marking a quiz, use that quiz formatively to provide some feedback and some guidance on what's next in their learning. It's not this completely separate bank. Assessment is just gathering evidence about student learning, which I know you already do, but just shift a little bit and prioritize the use of feedback and formative assessment using assessments formatively. Okay, so when we provide feedback, so let's say we've got the motive, the opportunity, and the means. Now, what does that feedback look like? First, we are looking for those productive responses. Whatever, this is going to sound sort of like a play on words and sort of oversimplified, but here's the deal. What works in feedback is what works. When you provide feedback to students, if they take your feedback and try to advance their proficiency, maybe they aren't successful, but they at least immerse themselves back in their work, you have yourselves effective feedback. If they don't, then you can't call it effective. See, a teacher can't say, I give my students effective feedback, but they don't do anything with it. You can say, I give my students feedback and they ignore it, but you can't call it effective unless it triggers a productive response from the recipient. As you're thinking about giving feedback, rather than talking about what was, talk about what's next. Here's what's next for you, right? Focus and lean forward, if you will, with your feedback to talk about next steps. There'll be time for judgment when it's summative assessment, time to say this was right, this was wrong, this is correct, this is incorrect, all of those things. But we've got to get past that and look at why they're incorrect. What errors are they making? How can we guide them going forward? Third, make sure the feedback is targeted. Okay, we don't want feedback that is too pedestrian or too sophisticated for where the learner is. We want feedback that is at or just slightly above where they are, so it pushes their thinking, but it's within reach so they can do something with that. 4, is it strength-based? Not solely strength-based, but we balance strengths and that which needs strengthening. And I might suggest maybe a 2-to-1 ratio or a 3-to-2 ratio, because remember that hope and efficacy piece and that confidence, that coat of armor, right? Imagine here's the one thing you do well, here's 12 things you need to work on. That confidence is going to start to be shot. It may be true that I have 12 things to improve, but what is most pressing? What are the 2 most pressing issues for me right now? Let me correct those and then give me the next 2. So be thoughtful about balancing both strengths and that which needs strengthening. And lastly, think about causing thinking. One of my favorite tools is a highlighter, or asking questions through feedback through the use of highlighters, cues, questions, prompts. Remember, not every moment of feedback has to be epic, right? The feedback, it's just about causing more learning, using highlighters to highlight where errors have, and let them find the errors. Let them search for the errors, let them wrestle with it and help them understand. So productive responses, what's next, targeted to the learner, strength-based, and causing thinking. That's how we use effective feedback. Now, the last thing I've shared with you, and I'm not going to get into too much detail, but a few years ago, I attended the AERA research conference, and the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, that's what SCALE stands for, talked about quality assessment items specific to mathematics. They actually went through 4 subjects at their session. And I wanted to provide this to you, but let me give it some context, okay? The context of this information was actually meant to guide large-scale assessment. The idea of how do we develop these items for sort of a larger purpose. But I thought they were worth sharing because, again, some of the advice, and you can read through and read them for yourselves for sure, but I loved the idea specific to, again, targeting the processes and the ideas, and not just looking at answers, but looking at the mathematical processes. I love this notion of multiple points of entry, sophisticated problems. So as you read through this, think about the applicability. Of course, the age of the students that you teach is going to impact the degree to which you can do some of these things, right? But multiple solution strategies, considerate presentation of ideas, technology maybe to elevate rigor, and engaging in meaningful context. So I just wanted to provide that to you. I hadn't planned on going through that. I hadn't planned on getting into detail, but I wanted you to have that. You can find it online, the reports online. Just type in scale quality assessment items from Stanford, and you can get all of those. So that, in a nutshell, is fast and furious, an hour. I wish we had more time and could go deeper and get into details, but essentially to get past right and wrong, we've got to get to a place where we're able to think about assessment as a way of feeding and nurturing the feedback for our students.
Awesome stuff, Tom. Thanks so much. And I know that this work that you've been doing for years now has, I know from my high school, I'm a high school teacher, and my experience, I remember seeing you at a workshop at our school board. You had come a few years ago. Yeah. And given a great talk about assessment, and I know it's changed my view of how we handle assessment, and I think a lot of what you're saying is like, I remember you talking about, I think it's not the exact same words, but it's like we're using assessment for like to empower kids, but not for punishment. I think like a lot of times, like when I first started teaching, I would be like, okay, well, the quiz is coming up, so you better do some work, right? And I think you've got so many great ideas here, and I know so many people here have appreciated your work. I've been monitoring the chat, so much great stuff. Yeah. So I want to thank you for joining us on a Sunday. I know that you are a busy guy, and it looks like you're in a hotel right now. So we'll let you get going here. But just as a couple housekeeping items for some folks, we're going to give away. We have a door prize every session where we have I do want to get that door prize out to you folks from one of our sponsors. So if you've been joining us in our sessions, you know that to get this door prize, which is the book Invigorating High School Math, from Stephen Leinwand, who's actually presenting a little later this afternoon, and Eric Malot. Get in the chat. Let us know your biggest takeaway from Tom's session. That's going to give some feedback back to Tom, but also we're going to choose from that list. So anyone who types their biggest takeaway, we're going to pick one of those. And Tom, you've got the pleasure, you've got the honor, or the tough part to pick.
Wow.
Now, to what we usually do to make it like, to take the pressure off, is we do like a random scroll. It's almost like spinning a wheel. We kind of like scroll up, scroll down, stop, and we just point to one.
Okay.
But what you could do is you could be like, you know what, I really like that one. You could choose that one. But I'm going to leave that up to you. That's what we've been doing with our speakers. Pick one of those. One of those is going to win our book here that Heineman's giving away, and we'll get that shipped out to that person. And also, you get to see all these big takeaways.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah, no, it's great to see. The one I want to just, before I choose, I want to just say one more thing to everyone, because I have noticed a few of the comments where folks are saying, feeling like, inspired but overwhelmed. And I definitely appreciate you saying that you're inspired, but feeling overwhelmed and there's lots to do. The last thing I'm going to say is be patient with yourselves, okay? This assessment journey began for me 17 years ago, over 17 years ago. So my only advantage over many people is just longevity. It's just I've been at this for a long time. Mm-hmm. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, just let it marinate, be patient with yourself. And it's a cliche, I know, but it really matters when it comes to this assessment work, which is think big, but start small. Just start and slowly incorporate your practices. Okay, I'm going to close my eyes and scroll 5 times.
Yeah, while you're scrolling, I was just going to say, like, that's a great message to give everyone, because I think everyone sees, people see a final product, but they don't see the journey leading there. And they think, I have to go from here to here immediately. And whereas we know that it's taken us, like you said, years. And it's taken me years to get to where I am in my assessment journey. So it's so important to remember that fact when you're seeing, especially on like, social media, you're seeing all these things that are like, I really want that in my classroom. I want to be like that, but it's a journey, and we're seeing final products. So thanks for that, Tom. Go ahead, give us a name here.
Okay. Of course I picked the name that I probably don't know if I'll pronounce this. It looks like I would say Sherry, Pierre.
Thanks.
Sherry, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Sherry has won. Actually, this is Sherry. I think this is like number 2 for you, which is amazing.
Is it?
She won yesterday, I'm pretty sure, in one of the sessions. So awesome stuff. Sherry, you have
her lucky weekend.
Yeah. Congratulations to you, Sherry. You know the drill, I think. Can you send us an email, hit reply on one of those? Let us know, hey, I'm the Sherry that won the prize in Tom's session. And then send us your address as well if we don't have it yet, and we'll get that book shipped out to you. Folks, one more reminder here, replays, especially this replay, will also go up in the replay area of the website as soon as it's done processing. And they're available all night tonight. Then they're heading on over to the Make Math Moments Academy. Don't forget to grab your 30 days free there. And we're sending out certificates on Monday or so. Look for an email from us on how to get your certificate. Tom, I want to thank you so much for joining us here, and we'll let you get on your way. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone. And if there's anything I can do to help support you going forward, just feel free to reach out. Would love to hear from you. So have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, awesome. We'll probably we'll reach out to you and see if you want to chat on our podcast and kind of keep that conversation going.
Hey, we could do a little pod swap.
Let's do that. Let's do that.
Idea.
Let's
I like
do that.
that idea. I'm always looking for guests as well, so it'd be wonderful.
Perfect.
All right.
That's perfect. So thanks, Tom, and everyone
Thanks,
else.
everyone.
Yeah, take care, everyone else. If you want to jump over, I'm actually going to jump right over to our session. We're hosting our session right now. Kyle's already started it, so we'll get over there. Take care, everybody, and have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Yeah.